evening, and welcome back. I see a lot of familiar faces from the 2 o'clock lecture. Thank you for coming back. And for those of you who didn't attend the 2 o'clock, the recording of that lecture, all about the theft of the Mona Lisa, will be on our YouTube channel at flintarts. Or you can find that through our website, flintarts.org. But if you go onto YouTube and search Flint Institute of Arts, you can find it that way. Usually takes us about 5-7 days to get that posted, so give us some time and you can check it out for yourself. For those of you who don't know, I am Tracy Glab, the Executive Director of the Flint Institute of Arts Museum and Art School. It's my pleasure to welcome you tonight to this evening's Sheppy Dog Fund Lecture. Tonight, we have guest speaker, Dr. Noah Charney, with us to present Brushed Aside, the Untold Story of Women in Art. Earlier today, as I mentioned, he presented a lecture on the thefts of the Mona Lisa, and it was so good. I learned so much, and there's like so much more to know. So if you, even in the lecture, the book is going to give you even more information. There will be a Q&A directly after this lecture and a book signing in the lobby for both books, the Mona Lisa book and the Brushed Aside book. So they are on sale in our museum shop. As always, museum members get a discount. Many of you also may recall that Dr. Charney was with us in 2017 for our Thompson. He was our Thompson lecturer. He spoke on the art of forgery. And then earlier this year, also available on our YouTube channel, he did a virtual talk in the middle of the night because he lives in Slovenia. It was a live lecture, but he was up all night to give us this lecture on a very fascinating talk about the sculptures that are associated with the zodiac in China. So it was quite an interesting talk on its own. The Sheppy Dog Fund Lecture was established in 2012 by Dr. Alan Klein to address the topics of art, religion, and history. Thank you, Alan, for continuing to bring these wonderful lectures to the Flint Institute of Arts. After this evening's lecture, the next Sheppy Dog Fund Lecture will be on November 21st, and it's going to be quite a unique experience. Dr. Justin Sledge, who is a frequent Sheppy Dog Fund lecturer, he does a lot of esoteric talks on angels and demons and magic and all kinds of interesting things. Well, he's got a side project. He makes his own absinthe, and so he's going to give us a talk on absinthe and the arts. So it's going to be quite interesting. And right after, we're going to have an absinthe tasting. The lecture is free, but the tasting for the absinthe is going to be a ticketed event because we can't give away free booze. And you have to be 21, obviously, to participate. But it's going to be a unique experience at the Flint Institute of Arts. Before I introduce our guests, I have some people to thank. First, the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation for their continued support. It's really so deeply appreciated and helps us do so many things at the FIA. I'd also like to thank the citizens of Genesee County who demonstrated their support for the FIA by the means of the Genesee County Arts, Education, and Cultural Enrichment Millage, which provides free entry every day. It's just 7 days a week here at the FIA for Genesee County citizens. So thank you. And then for those who are not privileged to live in Genesee County, a big thank you to Huntington Bank to sponsor Huntington Free Saturdays, which allows everyone beyond our county borders to have free entry on Saturdays. So thank you, Huntington Bank. Last but certainly not least, for the Ford Foundation Equity Fund of the Community Foundation of Greater Flint has provided support for us to have ASL interpretation at all of our public lectures. So thank you for that. And just a little reminder that our late nights, we used to be open late nights on Thursdays. That has moved to Fridays starting last week. And we're kicking it off with a partnership with the Flint Institute of Music the music around town. So it's a free concert outside. You can either get here early and get a chair, or bring your own lawn chair or blanket and be out on the lawn. And there's a cost for the food and beverages, but it's a lot of fun. And if you've never been to one of them, I highly recommend it. It's really a fun thing. And again, new, because we're open, you can come inside on those hot July and August nights to cool down and look at some art. So you can come inside if you want to. Now, please take a moment for everyone to silence your electronic devices. I'll wait, because last time it didn't work. We heard some crickets and some other weird stuff, so really try to silence everything, because it interrupts the speaker and it's annoying. So, all right. Dr. Noah Charney is an international best-selling author of more than 20 books. We had a hard time counting how many. You can tell us when you come up here. Translated into over 14 languages. And he'll tell you a little bit about what he does, but he's such an interesting person, and I've personally encountered him both through lectures, podcasts, and lots of documentaries. So he'll mention these to you. But he's also a professor of art history specializing in art crime. Has taught at Yale University, Brown University, and American University in Rome. He's the founder of the Association for Research into Crimes Against Art. He writes regularly for magazines and newspapers, including The Guardian, The Washington Post, The Observer, and the Art newspaper. He lives in Slovenia with his wife, children, and their hairless dog, Hubert van Eyck. Everyone, please join me in a warm Flint welcome for Dr. Noah Charney.
Thanks so much, Tracy. Okay. Welcome back for those of you who were with me earlier, and thanks to all of you who came to join me for this afternoon's lecture. It's such a pleasure to be here. I had great fun back in 2017. Today I ate a coney dog and apple cider donuts and cinnamon rolls and an apple cider slushy, which I'd never heard of, but it was a big hit. I was all over the farmer's market, so you guys got a great thing going. A little bit more about my background. Today's talk, or rather this afternoon's talk, is a little bit outside of my area of expertise. I'm known as a specialist in this history of art crime. But I'm also a professor of art history more generally. And one of the things that struck me as I was researching for other books, particularly a 2017 book I wrote called Collector of Lives, Giorgio Vasari and the Invention of Art, is that there's relatively little written about how women influenced the art world. And there are very good books, usually monographs about individual female artists. And there are some large-scale encyclopedic books. For example, Phaidon has a book of 400 women artists, which has one work representative of each and a little paragraph about them. But there's almost nothing written about how women influenced art beyond those who are practicing artists. And so what I wanted to do was try to have a book that would take a 360-degree view of how women have influenced the story of art. And women artists is just one component of it. Now, I was a little bit shy about this, but then my editor told me, you don't have to be Egyptian to write a book about Egyptology. So I felt like it was okay. And if the book didn't exist that I would have liked to have read, then it would be socially acceptable for me to write it. And my goal also was part inspired by reading a very famous feminist art history essay by Linda Nochlin, written in 1971, it was initially called Why Are There No Great Women Artists? And then they changed it to Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? And I read this as an art history student, and it was introduced to me as a feminist essay. And I found myself reading it and thinking that it was not feminist at all, in the sense that I thought it was starting with the thesis statement, right in the title, there have never been any great women artists. And I thought, that's ridiculous. I can think of dozens of them. And I imagine that many of you can, but when you think of great women artists, you probably think of 20th century artists, in particular the second half of the 20th century, when it's no longer within any fragment of doubt that women should be artists and can be great artists and can be just as influential as men. But when I was looking at this, I specialized in 16th century European art, and I had to go back to Giorgio Vasari. Giorgio Vasari is the godfather of art history. He wrote in 1550 a book called Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, which was a big bestseller, and it was a group biography of artists, many of whom he knew. And he reserves a chapter for one female artist named Properzia de Rossi. I have to apologize to our ASL interpreter. Italian names are a pain in the butt to sign, but she's fighting the good fight. And so he's got this chapter on her in which he names her and 3 other female artists and praises them, I'm going to say very highly for 1550. So if I read you some quotes from Vasari, it's going to sound like it's quite misogynistic, even though it means well. But for the time, this was really going out on a limb to include them at all. And what's interesting is he included these 4 women artists, and he excluded Albrecht Dürer and Jan van Eyck, who are on anyone's list of greatest artists ever, but they didn't fit with his thesis. His thesis was the greatest art of all is from Tuscany, particularly from Florence, and Michelangelo is the greatest artist who ever lived. Fair enough, but he has artists in here who otherwise might not have survived the tides of history and who we can focus on. But the thing is, it's just a handful of them. And when I did research, I found a great many more women artists than I had learned about when I was a student. But I was interested also in women beyond the creators. So when I was studying, I did my postgraduate work in England, and I was one of 2 guys. It was all women, and all my professors were women. And most of the books that I read were written by women. And so I had this funny situation. I had a sensation that art history is largely occupied by women today. And I don't know how, I was wondering how long ago it was when women made their presence so felt. But when I did a bit of research, I realized that many of the most influential scholars and critics, patrons, collectors, were women. And so I tried to include all of that in a book that, it's not a long book, but it tries to be a mosaic. And as a result, I go into less depth about any individuals, trying to show as wide and broad view of how women have positively influenced the art world as I could. And that also includes women in works of art, women as muses or models. There are lots of ways that one can influence, but the result is, I hope, very much empowering, and it's a respectful refutation of Linda Nochlund's famous essay. And the last chapter goes into depth. I break down her essay step by step and talk about what she's trying to do with it, because I understand what she's trying to do. She's trying to be provocative. But I think her thesis statement, there have been no great women artists to begin with, is problematic. And I talk about why that's the case. So I'd like to introduce you to parts of that today, and I have my magic clicker. And I have not given this lecture that often, so I have a cheat sheet, especially with quotes on it. I gave this lecture online for the Detroit Institute of Arts in the fall, so you guys are way ahead of them. You have me in person. Just a little bit more about the work that I do. I'm a pop professor. That means I don't teach full-time anywhere, because that's too much like work. I teach for fun periodically, and I do a lot of other things that are related to the same subject. But it's hard to count the books. I think I have 22 books now. There are 4 in this series of guides to museums in Spain, so I don't know if that counts as one or more. But the ones we're talking about today are here and here, but if you're interested in learning more, you can visit the website, noahcharney.com. And then I do all these other things too. So I do TV presenting, and you can see me on Discovery Channel or National Geographic. I do recorded video lectures for the great courses, which you can subscribe to. I do TED videos. I host BBC shows. Totally random. I'm the ambassador of tourism for Slovenia. If anyone is interested in visiting Slovenia, talk to me afterwards. And I appear in videos promoting it, and I host the official podcast in English for Slovenia tourism and whatnot. So let's begin with some recognizable figures. Now, I'm sure if you close your eyes and think about women artists, you can name a lot of them. You can think about people like Frida Kahlo, Georgia O'Keeffe, Marina Abramovic, who is probably the most famous living woman artist, and it was a great delight. She wrote the afterword to the book Brushed Aside, which you can read. But then if I ask you to think back to pre-modern women artists, you might think of Artemisia Gentileschi, particularly in your proximity to the DIA, but then you might run out of names, and that would be fairly legitimate because people tend not to know these influential women artists, particularly from before the 20th century. It's really after the Second World War where it becomes common to have influential, important women artists, but there were a great many before. Now, why was it such a smaller number? There's a very practical reason for this, and this is what Linda Nochlin explores in her essay. One of the main reasons why there have been relatively few women artists prior to the 20th century is the bottega system, or the system of studios that ran through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and really until the 18th century when they started to dissolve and shift towards academies as a way where you would learn how to do art. In the bodega system, you would have a master, and the master would have become a master by apprenticing to an established master artist in their medium, painting, sculpture. We'll talk about some other media as well beyond those most popular ones. And then when that assistant is ready, or feels they're ready, usually between the age of 16 and 18, they can submit what's called a masterpiece. That's the origin of the word. We use masterpiece now to mean any great work of art, but it literally means the work of art that a young artist submits to the local guild that oversees the profession of painter or sculptor in your region, and offers it up and says, is this good enough? Do you other masters decide that I am skillful enough to be a master myself? And if they receive that, that accreditation, then they can open their own studios and accept their own commissions within that community. Now, those masters ran studios that were full of men and boys. Apprentices starting at age 8, usually up to age 14 or 16, would be apprentices who would be sent as essentially live-in interns with a master to learn the trade, and would assist the master but with more menial tasks, and then they could graduate to being paid assistants. And that's an atmosphere where young women would have been probably uncomfortable, but it was considered distracting and morally inappropriate. It was a very much like locker rooms, very stinky atmosphere. and there was a distinction also between women who were effectively not allowed to have a profession. You could get married, you could be a prostitute, or you could be a nun. Those were pretty much the three options available to you, which is rather bleak. And there were exceptions to that, particularly for aristocratic women, but they were much rarer. It was hard to avoid one of those three outcomes, and none of them involved working for yourself. So most of the women artists prior to the era of academies were trained by a father who was an artist, or they were aristocrats who were given a sort of broad arts and humanities training and showed particular skill at one art form and decided to follow through with that. But usually they had to do it more as a hobby because it was socially acceptable for them to create things, but not socially acceptable for them to have a profession. That changed in, well, the earliest academies are in the 16th century in Italy. In fact, Vasari, the guy I mentioned as the godfather of art history, who was the court portraitist to the Medici family in Florence, also founded the first art academy. And then it sprang up, really developed in the 18th century in both Italy and France. And then you also get the opening of the Royal Academy of Arts in London, which I'll talk about a bit later. And those academies started to welcome women very slowly. This was a patriarchal environment. Again, at this period, women were not generally allowed to have professions, but when women were permitted into the academies, it was in a secondary capacity. And one of the main things that they were excluded from that really inhibited their ability to train as an artist is they were not allowed to be in the presence of nude models. It was considered socially unacceptable. And that is one of the main ways that artists train, by sketching nudes. And so they didn't have access to that. They were welcome to all of the courses at the academy except live nude drawing. And so that really inhibited the way that they were able to practice. And it was very exceptional for a woman to be able to achieve a high status as an artist because of these roadblocks thrown in their way by the patriarchal society and the norms of the time. And this was really throughout Europe. So these are some of the very good points that Linda Nochlin made. And she went on to say, that's why there have never been any great women artists. And I would say that's why it's so exceptional that there have been a great many great women artists. If we go back enough in time, it turns out the very first artists we know of in history were women. More than 80% of all of the handprints found in caves of ancient cave paintings were female hands. So you go back as far as you like. If we look at fertility sculptures like the famous Venus of Willendorf, although there are scores of them that are similar to that are slightly less renowned, there is no reason not to think that they were created by women, for women, and there's reason to think that. Something that is probably used as part of some fertility ritual. It stands to reason that that might be the realm of women creators, and there's certainly no reason to think that it wasn't. So we have a lot of these reasons to look at the very origins of creating of art to be in the hands of women. Now, when you get to the 18th century in particular, you get art critics. Nobody likes art critics, right? They're always grumbling about something. Well, the most praise that art critics would give women was usually something to the extent of, she's so good you'd think she were a man, which was high praise back then, but this is a sort of thing that sounds horribly misogynistic today, but was considered going out on a limb to speak up in favor of a woman artist back in the day. So I'm going to do a little bit of a picaresque here. I cherry-picked some cases that I wanted to show you. In the book, there are loads more, but I wanted to show you some women artists, patrons, scholars, influencers, and also what women represent when depicted in works of art. So let's look at some examples. Okay, here we have the lovely Properzia de Rossi. I'm not sure she was lovely in person. What she created was certainly lovely, and she was a really larger-than-life character. She's one of two exceptions that I'm going to show you to the rule that most women were either aristocratic or the daughters of artists who were able to practice as an artist. So she was from Bologna. She is the subject of one of Vasari's chapters, and that's exceptional because the other subject of his chapters are people like Michelangelo and Raphael and Leonardo and Titian. So he held her in really high esteem. She was very well-rounded. She was given a general humanities and arts education by her father, and she was particularly, supposedly she had the best singing voice of anyone in Bologna, so she could have gone in that direction. But she decided she loved sculpture. Now, sculpture was particularly considered the realm of men because it is physically hugely demanding. If you've ever seen somebody sculpting out of marble, you have to use hammers and chisels. There's vibrations. You have to really engage your muscles. To really engage your muscles. It's pretty bad for your health. They didn't have ventilation systems back then. You're inhaling marble powder. It's a messy sort of macho world to be in. So it's exceptional, particularly that she liked it so much. And she got some high-level commissions, including Bologna Cathedral. Her most famous work is this, Joseph and Potiphar's Wife. Now, I'm always hesitant to look for subject matter and interpretation that seems to reflect the gender of the creator, because I think that's something doesn't feel right about that. But this is a particularly powerful scene where you have Potiphar's wife. This is the story of Joseph, you know, the Technicolor Dreamcoat guy, and the Pharaoh's wife is trying to seduce him, and he wants none of it, but she's trying to grab him and pull him into bed. And this is a particularly interesting scene because in most cases, this was a theme commissioned by members of the clergy to show the dangers of hanging out with immoral women. But here we have a woman who seems much more powerful and decisive and aggressive than Joseph, who knows what she wants. She's got big, muscly arms, and she's going to get exactly what she wants. And I think that that's the sort of interpretation that I haven't seen in works by men of the same subject matter. Now, Propertia had a really weird specialty. It's going to sound like I'm making this up. She specialized in miniature sculptures carved out of the pits of stone fruit. Exactly. Cherries, peaches, and apricots. I wish I were making this up. This is Propertia's peach pit. That sounds like a nightclub, right? She made a lot of these, and you have to be really skillful with very surgical level material. This peach pit is covered in faces. You can't really see this. But supposedly, according to Vasari, she carved an entire Passion of Christ scene with many figures in it out of a peach pit. And only a few of these survive, unfortunately. But I have, well, part of the reason I have my cheat sheet is I have some quotes for you because some of these are kind of funny. So this quote from Vasari, lavishing praise on Propertia, quote, he says, "Nor have women been ashamed to put their tender white hands to mechanical things, and amid the coarseness of marble and the roughness of iron, to follow their desires and bring fame to themselves, as did our Propertia de Rossi, a young woman talented not only in household matters, but in infinite forms of knowledge that are the envy of men as well as women." It sounds like a caricature of misogyny now, but again, this was about as out on a limb as you can get back in 1550 to praise women. Now, this woman is truly exceptional. This is a work of Sophonisba Anguissola. Apologies to the ASL translator, but what a great name, right? I just love it. So she was from a not very wealthy but aristocratic family in Cremona. And her father had all daughters and had all of them educated as broadly as possible. And 4 of the 7 daughters became professional artists. Sophonisba was the only one who was a truly great artist. She was famous enough that Giorgio Vasari went to visit her in Cremona in person. And she was really supported by her father. This is an era when fathers decided the fate of their daughters. And then when the father was not in charge, and then it was the husband. So we have stories throughout the history of female artists where they showed talent, but their father held them back. For example, Marietta Robusti, who was the daughter of Tintoretto, had the option, she was invited to move abroad and into the patronage of a foreign prince because she was so skillful a painter, and her father wouldn't let her leave Venice. He didn't want her to go abroad. He was worried about what might happen to her, and so he held her back. So she had a more modest career back in Venice. But Sophonisba had a very elaborate career and a very long one. What we see here is called The Game of Chess. This is probably her most famous piece. It's from 1555, and it shows her mother and 3 of her sisters literally playing chess. It's a genre called a conversation piece. Most of the time, women would be, if they were creating art at all, particularly paintings, they were expected to create subject matter that was considered not too important. There was a hierarchy of subject matter in art. And at the top was history painting, which meant scenes of famous historical figures, which included religious scenes or mythological scenes, which were deemed history, or portraits of illustrious people. And then you go down the ladder, and at the bottom are still lifes, landscapes, and genre scenes. Genre scenes are scenes from everyday life. And this is a genre scene, but this is something that she painted relatively early on, and she was focused on portraits of historical figures who she met and in many cases befriended. And she was recruited by this woman, Queen Elizabeth of Valois, who was one of the wives of Philip II, the Habsburg monarch of Spain. And she was apparently a very good artist too. And so she recruited Sofonisba to teach her about painting. And the two became close friends. Now, there's a social system at play here where if Sofonisba had not already been from an aristocratic family, she would not have been able to be recruited by another aristocrat, particularly a queen. So the social caste systems didn't allow passage from one to another, which is why many of the people we're describing who were Renaissance artists who were involved with setting up their own studios and dealing with aristocrats who were aristocrats themselves. But the two became close friends. And this is a portrait of Queen Elizabeth of Valois. And this is a spectacular portrait. Sofonisba is as good as any painter I have ever seen. We could do a whole talk just on her, but if you Google her and see the other works of art that she did, it's entirely astounding. And also a shame she isn't better known. She moved with her father's blessing to Rome for several years and met Michelangelo. And the story goes that she brought him a picture of a girl laughing to show what she was capable of, a drawing. And he said, "This is good, but can you show me a boy weeping?" Because he thought that would be much trickier to do well. And she went home and drew one and sent it to him, and he immediately recognized her talent. And for 2 years, he basically tutored her. And that was really exceptional as well. Michelangelo had his own studio. She wasn't a part of the studio, but he tutored her privately. And while she was in Rome, she went into the employ of the Spanish king, the Habsburg king, and became a lady-in-waiting and the tutor of Queen Elizabeth of Valois, and moved to Madrid. And she made this portrait then. She was considered to be someone who was so skillful that the great painter Antony van Dyck sought her out, and their lives barely lined up. But he was so amazed by her talent that he asked to have the honor of portraying her. And he went to meet her in her retirement. She said she was 92. She was actually 96, but she was trying to slip in there and seem a bit younger. And he made a portrait of her. And it was a show of respect for someone who he so admired. Now, one of the problems that we have as art historians, or at least art historians of the past have had, is there's a danger that if a work of art doesn't have an overt documentary history of who painted it, we tend to look for the authorship based on style or based on our opinion, and that's notoriously problematic. For many years, this painting was attributed to a man because art historians thought there ain't no way there was a woman who was this good. And it's a shame because I have a feeling that there are works of art out there made by women but just rather dismissively attributed to men simply because the assumption is that a woman wouldn't be able to be as skillful. Now, we have this focus on painting and sculpture and architecture. A little bit is Giorgio Vasari's fault because he's so focused on that in his definitive, really first work of art history, his Lives. But in the story of women as artists, there are some other art forms that deserve more credit than they get. So it wasn't really until the 16th century that painters, sculptors, and architects had any social status that was higher than other craftspeople. There were guilds for all of the crafts you can imagine in any town that would supervise who was allowed to practice that craft. And you'd have guilds of cabinet makers and cobblers who made shoes and candle makers and so on. And until starting with Jan van Eyck in the mid-15th century in the north of Europe, and with Raphael circa 1500 in Italy, you got the first artists who were such charismatic, intelligent figures that they were proactive members of aristocratic courts, and the fact that they were such celebrities and so admired elevated the status of their profession. But it didn't everywhere. If we look at the story of Diego Velázquez, the greatest painter in the history of Spain in the 17th century, he had to pretend that painting was a hobby because it was not considered socially acceptable to be a painter, even if you're the greatest in the history of Spain. And he said, yeah, I paint a little bit on the side, but his main job was working as part of the court of the Habsburg monarch. And he was basically given all of these tasks that now we look back and say, what a shame he didn't have more time to paint, because he had to do all of these bureaucratic administrative things because it wasn't socially acceptable just to be a painter. So it wasn't across the board. But in Italy, the painters were elevated in status from Raphael on. But in England, one of the art forms that was already elevated in status because it was practiced by queens was needlepoint. Now, needlework tends to get very little PR, unfortunately. You guys have a great tapestry exhibit here. But this is something that's worth noting because starting with Queen Elizabeth I, their aristocratic, extremely influential women would practice needlepoint and do so at a remarkably high level. And these are really masterpieces. Maybe the most famous thing that's called a tapestry but isn't actually a tapestry, it's really a needlework, is the Bayeux tapestry, which shows the Battle of Hastings. And that was made entirely by women. But this is something that aristocratic women were trained in that was considered socially acceptable for them to do, provided it wasn't a profession. And we have work that survives by Queen Elizabeth I. And this is interesting. Elizabeth Talbot, who's best known as Bess of Hardwicke, was a really powerful, fascinating, and empowered woman who used marriage to her advantage. She married 4 times, each time upgrading her wealth and ruling over her husband strategically. And her first husband was in charge of basically maintaining in an elegant, non-prisony situation Mary, Queen of Scots. So she wasn't allowed to leave the estate of Bess of Hardwicke's first husband, but she was kept company by Bess. The two became friends, and these are examples of what's called the Oxborough Hangings, which is a series of 100 needlework panels that cover a very large room, all aspects of it, including like, I can't remember what you call it, the flappy bits at the bottom of a bed. You know what I'm talking about? That sounds very scientific, right? So we're pretending to be a professor here. So all the aspects of that room, and you can see the monogram, this ES monogram was Bess's signature that she included. And each one of these, if you ever done needlepoint, this is tricky to do. And they spent years doing it together. Bess of Hardwicke was actually the second wealthiest woman in Europe after Queen Elizabeth I, by the time she got to her 4th husband. So she was doing very well for herself. And this is a time you have to understand there were limited ways that women could be empowered. And this strategic marriage was one of them. And so that might sound funny to us now, but given limited opportunities to make a life the way you want it to be for women, this was about as good as it gets. And she was also hugely influential. Not only through her wealth, she would commission houses, estates, works of art. She had an elaborate art collection, but she was also influential in terms of style. So she designed and commissioned a building called Hardwicke Hall that was her final residence. And there was a jingle that people said at the time, Hardwick Hall, more glass than wall, because it had so many windows, there was more glass visible than the superstructure that holds the glass in place. Now today, after modernism and whatnot, we're used to all glass houses, but in the 16th century, this was quite something. And she pioneered that concept that you want as much window as possible when it was not the done thing, and people followed suit. So you can be influential in many different ways. You can be influential in commissioning things, designing, creating, and also having what you would personally like be created at such a high level that people want to emulate you. Now, this woman, if there's anybody on the list that can refute Linda Nauchlin's argument, it's Angelica Kauffmann. So Angelica Kauffmann was born in 1741 in Switzerland, and her father was a painter. And by the age of 15, she was working on commissions with him to decorate churches. She was a prodigy right from the start. And the two of them, she and her father, moved to Rome and set up a studio where they would paint on behalf of grand tourists. If you've heard of the Grand Tour, this was a popular, maybe pastime is the wrong word, but wealthy or aristocratic Europeans, particularly from England, would go on a grand tour, which meant traveling the European continent to see famous sites, particularly going to Rome, Venice, and some of them went as far as Greece, maybe even to Istanbul. Depending on whether it was a safe place to go, this is a period when the Ottoman Turks were making incursions into Europe as well. But particularly in the 18th century, this was a thing that everyone would do. It's like going Eurailing for American college students. Do people still do that? Maybe. I did that. That's okay. So they set up in Rome, and they would accept commissions and meet influential people, because going to their studio became one of the things that one did when you went to Rome on a grand tour. You had to go to the Kauffmann studio. And one time Angelica, entertained the wife of an English diplomat. And the wife was so taken with her personally and her talents that she invited her to come to London. And Angelica was supported by her father, moved to London, and was there for 15 years. And while she was in London, she painted very proactively. She painted around 500 works during her career, which is a lot. Oil painting takes a long time to finish. You have to let layers of oil dry before you add another layer, and that can take weeks for the oil to be completely dry. So to create 500 works is really remarkable. At least 200 of them survive today. And while she was in London, she was introduced to all the influential folk in the art community, as well as patrons, and she became friends with Sir Joshua Reynolds, who was the most influential artist in London at the time. And she became one of the co-founders of the Royal Academy of Arts in London in 1768. She was one of only two women. The other was an artist named Mary Moser, who were co-founders, and it would be another 200 years before another woman was permitted to study at the Royal Academy, but she was one of the founders. And she was a history painter. Now, I mentioned before that this was not socially acceptable for women to do, because this was what only the really great artists did. But she considered herself, as she rightly should have, as part of that upper echelon. So she was influential also in terms of style and theory. So if you study art history, you have to study art theory, which nobody likes. But there's a lot of isms and methodologies and whatnot, and you have to sort of suffer through it. And one of the people you come to is a guy named Winkelmann, who wrote in German. His special approach to art history was juxtaposing two different artistic styles next to each other, which is still how a lot of art history is taught. You have a Romantic era painting next to a neoclassical painting, so you can see how the isms differ. So he developed that, but he was also a proponent of neoclassicism, which is a renewed interest in subject matter and the moral themes of the classical ancient world. And that was the most popular artistic movement in 18th century Europe, in France and England certainly, and Angelica Kauffman is the reason it came to England. She had read Winckelmann before his texts were available in English, and she was a proponent of this new artistic style that was already established on the continent, and she helped bring it to England. She was also influential in the decorative scheme of the Royal Academy of Arts, and she was subversive in doing so. So she was commissioned by the Academy to make allegorical paintings to decorate the main lecture hall. And one of the lecture halls was where they had nude live drawing, which she was not allowed to attend. So she snuck one of her allegories on the ceiling as a sort of inside joke, making fun of how stupid it was that women weren't allowed to attend. So she's got, this is not a real person, this is an allegorical personification of the concept of drawing. And because you're not allowed to look at a naked man, how are you supposed to learn? Well, she's looking at, for extra credit points, anyone recognize what famous statue she's looking at? No pressure. The Belvedere torso, it's called. It's part of the Vatican collection. And it is torso, no legs, arms, or head. It used to be a Hercules statue. But if you look at it from the front, it's full of muscles, and you can see his naughty bits. And so she's got this guy looking right at the naughty bits. And so it's an inside joke. It's like sticking a middle finger up at all of these stupid men who she has to deal with. And I love that. You can see a self-portrait of her. It took her 5 years to do this self-portrait, and it's truly remarkable. And this was on the cover of the Art History 101 book that I learned from back in the Mesozoic era. But I remember that this was on the cover, and there were like 3.5 women in the entire book listed, but they stuck this on the cover, and it was kind of lame because you thought they were being quite proactive, but no. She also became famous because she recognized the value of engravings as a way to promote your art. You have to think in terms of how many people would see a painting or a sculpture. You would have to go to the location. You'd have to be given permission to see it if it was in someone's private home or in a palace or if it was in a church. The chances of you seeing a single unique painting or sculpture were relatively small. But engravings, particularly after the art form had been established as a way to promote an artist's work, Albrecht Dürer being the first proactive, self-promoting artist circa 1500 with his wonderful engravings. This is, of course, in the 18th century, much later, but she became world famous through her engravings of her paintings that traveled at an affordable rate because there were multiples of them. And they were works on paper, so they could travel to places that her paintings never could. So the ability of these images created by her to be disseminated throughout Europe helped create an international reputation for her that would have been much more difficult if you had to rely on stumbling across one of her paintings in order to get to know her work. And there's a little coda to this showing just how respected and influential she was. This painting here was made by a guy named Nathaniel Hone, who had a bone to pick with Sir Joshua Reynolds. He didn't like the guy. Joshua Reynolds was the most influential painter in London. This painting was submitted for display at the Royal Academy. It's called The Conjurer, but it was never shown because the board of the Royal Academy thought that this was disrespectful both to Joshua Reynolds and to Angelica Kauffman, because this was implying that Joshua Reynolds was having an affair with Angelica, because this is Angelica Kauffman as a little girl. He never met her as a little girl, but she's staring at his naughty bits, which is inappropriate, and he's shown as much older than he actually was, as this weird sort of magician with nude sculptures in the background, and it's basically like trying to make fun of him in his own institution. And so it was not permitted, but the rationale for it not being permitted for display was because it didn't shine a good light on one of the founding members, Angelica. Now, let's look a little bit at what women inside paintings represent. Now, that might sound funny, but sometimes they don't represent themselves, and it's useful to look at a few examples of what women can represent when shown in a painting. Of course, they can be a real person. Now, that sounds silly. Of course, they can be a real person. Today, that sounds silly, but back in, let's say, the 16th century when this was made, this is a portrait of Anne of Cleves, the fourth wife of King Henry VIII, by Hans Holbein the Younger. You had to have a really good reason to make a painting or a sculpture back then. The raw materials were prohibitively expensive for you to just play around with. Nobody made works of art on spec really until the late 17th century. It was only made on commission when someone paid you an advance to buy the materials, and so it had to be strategic. You needed to have a reason to make a work of art, particularly a complete work. Drawings were maybe made a little bit more quickly, but even those were expensive because paper was expensive. So someone has to have a good reason to portray you. And in this case, this is a piece of marketing for the potential of Anne of Cleves as a wife for Henry VIII. The problem was that she wasn't quite as lovely as this picture implied, or at least that's how the story goes. So when it came to the fourth wife of Henry VIII, there were a couple of people who were candidates, and Henry VIII had seen a picture of Princess Christina of Denmark, and apparently she was hot stuff. But she was not in a hurry to marry someone who had just killed his former wife. So she politely declined, and she had some line that I'm going to butcher, but she said, "If I had two heads, I'd be happy to give one of them to Henry." Anne of Cleves seemed to think this was going to be okay, but this was something that people did. They sent their portraitist ahead to portray. You know, now you take a picture and send it in a few seconds. Back in the day, you had to go spend a month with someone, paint their picture, and then spend another few weeks sailing back home and say, "Want to marry this person?" And it's like what's the flippy matchmaking app that post-dates my marriage? This is the example of it, but this is an oil painting. So, okay, portraits of historical women. Henry, they said, "Looks good to me, let's get married." And then as soon as he saw her, he said, quote, I like her not," and ran away. And apparently she didn't smell too good. I'm not sure if that's real or not, but that's how the story goes. And they got married, but apparently it never consummated. And in 6 months, she got a pretty good deal. He called her "my beloved sister." He seemed to like her as a friend. They were friends for the rest of their lives. He set her up in her own estate. And so she probably had the best deal of all of them, actually. But this is an example of an perhaps overly idealized portrait that almost caused problems. We also have self-portraits. Now, this is an important one, and one that I think deserves more credit than it gets. This is, believe it or not, the first self-portrait of an artist at work that we know of, from 1548, by Katharina von Hemison. Now, this is an artist who you might not have heard of, and it's a shame, but it's not a surprise. This is one of the pantheon of great women artists who don't get as much attention as they should. But there's a lot going on in this self-portrait. Now, a self-portrait is particularly distinctive because I just mentioned how expensive it is to get the equipment, the raw materials, the support, the pigments to make a painting. And the idea that you would make a self-portrait that no one commissioned is really distinctive. So that in and of itself, this is a statement that she is making. Nobody commissioned this. I made this myself. And the slide's a little bit too bright for you to see, but there are a couple things going on that make this more sophisticated than it might look at first. One is that right up here, she has in Latin, Ego Caterina de Hemison, me pinxi 1548, etatis suae 20. Or I, Catherine of the Hemisons, painted me in 1548 at the age of 20. Now, this was not the done thing. Artists did not sign their works regularly until the 19th century. What she's doing here is her own version of Albrecht Dürer's famous self-portrait at the age of 28, which is one I probably should have had on the slide for you. Sorry about that. But if you've maybe seen it, it's him looking like Jesus intentionally, facing forward as opposed to profile, which was reserved for pictures of Jesus, with a nice beard, and he's sort of fingering a mink lapel of his jacket. And it says in the top corner, Albrecht Dürer made me when I was 28 years old. And that was in 1505, I think. So she's saying, you know what? I got what Albrecht's got. She's doing it intentionally. And that's really brassy of her, and I love that confidence. She's also got more going on. This is, anyone want a million extra credit points if you can tell me what this stick is called that artists would use to steady their hand? Maul stick. Extra credit points around the house. Very good. The maul stick and the brush are meant at first glance to look like a cross. And this is a reference to some writing, particularly by Thomas Kempis, that talks about mirrors as a portal to self-discovery and to communion with God. I don't have the quotes with me, but there's direct quotes from Thomas Kempis about mirrors as a devotional tool. Why is she talking about mirrors? Well, it's easy to forget that in order to do a self-portrait, you have to look at a mirror. And most artists, if they could afford to, would keep a convex mirror in their studio. A convex mirror because flat mirrors, post-dated, they were very expensive. They were hard to make. Convex mirrors were more affordable and more ubiquitous. And so you look at your picture reflection in a convex mirror, and you frame the picture, and there's evidence to suggest that even if you're portraying someone else, many artists, including Caravaggio, looked at the reflection of the person they're portraying in a mirror and painted that rather than looking at the person directly, because the mirror superimposes the figure within the confines of the panel or canvas in a way that you don't have if you're looking at someone, unless you're doing this little director move thing. So what happens in a mirror, you have the opposite hands. Now, you were not allowed to be left-handed back in the day. Left-handed people were sinister. Something funny is going on from the Latin sinistra, meaning left. So even if you were left-handed, you would be trained to be right-handed because it was suspicious. But in a mirror reflection, you'd think she would be painting with what looks like her left hand. So she has corrected the mirror reflection for us, which is tricky to do. So there's a lot going on here, spiritually, optically, and in terms of the chutzpah of signing this great painting. And it's really important to the history of self-portraiture, but unfortunately not many people know the story. Now, we also have women as holy figures, and I could have picked a lot of different pictures to show you, but I pictured Caravaggio's Madonna of Loreto, which is in the Church of Sant'Agostino in Rome. Now, here we have the Virgin Mary with the baby Jesus, but they look not like you would expect them to, I imagine. And Caravaggio was, famously problematic. He was causing all sorts of problems. He was not someone you would want to be involved with. He beat up a waiter ostensibly over an overcooked plate of artichokes. He killed someone ostensibly because he lost a game of tennis to them, but they were both in love with the same prostitute. And he was the world's worst tenant. He had in various lawsuits with his landlady. He kept throwing rotten fruit at her whenever he saw her. He poked a hole in the roof of his his apartment to let natural light in, because he needed it for his studio, and it also let in, pigeons and whatnot. So don't want to rent a Caravaggio, thank you very much. But amazingly influential revolutionary artist. And there's a lot of suggestion that he intentionally made works of art initially commissioned by churches to look indecorous, that's the term translated from the Italian, so that they would be rejected and he could sell them instead to a private buyer, keeping the advance to cover the cost of the materials. And he did this on a number of occasions. This was kept by the church, but it really upset people for a bunch of reasons. Number one, he was unusual in that he chose as his models real people from the neighborhood of Rome that he lived in. Now, Rome's a big city now. It was relatively big back then, but it's the city of neighborhoods. And if you're in the area around Piazza Navona, and that's where you live, then there's a few block radius that's your sort of home territory, and everybody knows everyone. And one of the people they know is a woman named Maddalena, who was one of the local prostitutes. And she would be waiting on the corner outside the Church of Sant'Agostino looking to pick up dates, or whatever you call it. And so he picks her as the model for the Virgin Mary, which you see inside the church when you walk in and turn immediately to the left, and you see this picture. And today it sounds funny, but you can imagine super religious locals. They walk back, Maddalena, how's it going? Past the prostitute on the corner, they go in and they see her as the Virgin Mary on the altar. That didn't go over very well. What else was interesting? Well, the Madonna of Loreto is actually a devotional pilgrimage site where the Virgin Mary was supposed to have appeared. And what we're seeing here, it looks like a real person. This is a portrait of what the prostitute really looked like, with a baby Jesus that looks far too large, far larger than we would expect. This looks like, I don't know, a naked 3-year-old. And she is stepping outside of what looks like a sculptural niche. And what we're seeing is a vision that these two pilgrims are having. We're not meant to see a real person. We're meant to see the vision that they are having in their devotional prayer. But there were various other things that upset the churchgoers. One is these people look a bit too realistic. They look like they haven't bathed in a few months, and they're barefoot with dirty soles of their feet inside a church. This was not the done thing. What was expected on an altarpiece was a Raphael. And if you've seen works by Raphael, they're completely idealized. They don't look like anybody. Raphael actually kept a notebook with the most beautiful nose and the most beautiful ears he had seen, and invented a hybrid idealized face that he uses for all of his religious figures, whether they're male or female. Just stick a beard on them, they become a man. And everything is perfectly clean and balanced, and there's no movement, there's no suffering. These are the happiest crucifixion scenes you've ever seen. They're like just hanging out. Nobody's having any emotional issues. And then you get this instead, and it was really revolutionary. However, Caravaggio may have been a problematic murderer, nasty guy, bad tenant, but he was also extremely religious. And he was in keeping with the concepts promoted by the Council of Trent, which started in 1550 and lasted for more than a decade. And this was the emergency council run by the Catholic Church that decided on the Counter-Reformation. So we have the Reformation in Northern Europe, starting with Martin Luther, that is complaining about a bunch of things that the Catholic Church as an institution was doing that were problematic, and they were real complaints. And the Catholic Church was concerned about not losing their power and their constituents. And so they had these councils, a series of emergency meetings to decide what are we going to do. And it led to what's called the Counter-Reformation. And one of the things that came out of the Council of Trent was the idea that art should be used to try to make a more personal devotional experience with the public. So it may seem funny to think about this now, but prior to the Reformation, you would go to church and nobody would understand anything that's being said because it's all in Latin, and only the highest educated elites could understand Latin. So you would be going to church because that's what you had to do and because you believed in God and this was an important thing to you, but you had no idea what was being said until the sermon, which was the only thing in the vernacular, in your language. So it gets to be a problem because in the Reformation, the Martin Luther and his constituents are saying, you should be able to have a direct devotional experience with God. You shouldn't need this institution to intervene for you. And part of that is you should be able to read the Bible in your own language. And the idea of the Counter-Reformation, one of the things they came up with was to try to use art to help people have a more vivid, direct meditation in religious scenes. And one way to do this is you're supposed to visualize yourself at the historical times in Jesus' time. Or if that was too hard to do, you're supposed to imagine Jesus living today. And Caravaggio wound up painting that. And in a lot of his scenes, you have a hybrid of circa 1600 Rome, but with religious figures in it. So he was actually following the tenets of the Council of Trent, but to such an extent and so soon afterwards that the Catholic religious institutions basically weren't ready for the suggestions that they themselves had made. Okay, a couple of other things. What can a woman be in a work of art? Okay, we have mothers. This is a absolutely devastating work by Kata Kollwitz, a German artist. This is a super powerful etching. It's called Mother with a Dead Child, and it's almost difficult to look at, but I've never seen a work of art quite as emotionally powerful as this. And this is, again, it's hard to say, to project gender in the interpretation of a work of art, but if you have the experience of grieving over a dead child as a mother, I'm not sure that's something that a man would be able to create in a similarly effective way. This was created in 1903. Her brother had passed away as a child, and that's probably what she was recalling. But unfortunately, one of her two sons would die in the First World War about 10 years after this was created. But this is an absolutely emotionally devastating work, so you can have artists as mothers. I realize I got too excited. I'm going to have to speed up a little bit. So zipping ahead, witches. Now that sounds not politically correct, but witches were a popular theme in terms of both concern about them in early modern Europe and also a fascination with them. And this is an Albrecht Dürer image of a witch riding on a goat. Then we have classical nudes. Classical nudes were acceptable. This is basically a form of erotica that was considered socially acceptable if you call this a classical goddess. This is a reason you can have a naked lady in your living room because it's Venus. No problem. And what made it socially acceptable? You couldn't have any body hair. That was something that was way too realistic. But if it looks like a classical sculpture, it's okay. So this is started by Giorgione, completed by Titian. It's called Sleeping Venus. But works like this, single gentlemen would have them in their boudoir, and sometimes they would be covered with a curtain, and they would be revealed and giggled over when it was boys' night out and people came over to play poker and drink beer. This is the equivalent of it at a high level. Then you have realistic nudes. This is Eve from Jan van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece, which is considered too realistic. It was actually censored by Emperor Joseph II when he visited in the 18th century. She's got every little detail that a human being has, including you can see individual pores, you can see ingrown hairs on her skin. It was considered too realistic, but you can also have these realistic nudes as part of the oeuvre. Then we have erotica. This is Jean Fragonard's The Bolt. Erotica in the sense that this was commissioned as something meant to be titillating, and it's meant to be a pair of lovers meeting for a tryst, and the guy is closing the bolt to lock the door that's going to give them privacy, and it's meant to be a sexually charged piece. And then we have allegories. Now, any allegory that is a concept that ends in the letter A in Latin so a female gendered word. The allegorical personification was meant to be a woman. So that's the reason if you've been to the courthouse, hopefully just visiting, and you saw a blindfolded woman with a sword in one hand and scales in the other, that's justitia, justice, ends with an A, so the allegorical personification is as a woman. This is Eugène Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. This is an allegory for libertà, liberty, so it's a woman. And in this scene from the 1830 Paris uprisings, this is the only figure who isn't actually there. No one's looking at her. There's a topless lady. No, nobody's looking at her. They're busy with their own uprising, but she is an allegory that is representing the concept of liberty, leading the people. So I have to, okay, I should probably stop. Where's Tracy? If she's not here, we can keep on going, right? Okay, I get too excited. I have too much good stuff to tell you, so I'm going to just zip through, and then because I want to have a little time for questions for you. Very briefly, some of the famous patrons, Nefertiti, who is best known for this bust of her that was made in 1345 BC. And she and her husband Akhenaten, who founded the very first monotheistic religion in history, Atenism, that worshipped the sun god Ra, they were great patrons, and she was one of them. This bust, unearthed in 1912, is probably the single most influential to the story of female beauty in the 20th century. This was the thing that was copied. This was the, social media influencer prior to social media. And it's a very wonderful piece, and she was a great patroness as well. We also have Artemisia II, who commissioned and probably helped in the design of the tomb of Mausolus, her husband, also her brother. And this is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And she was influential in leading other spouses of great men to commission monuments, works of art, and tombs in honor of their deceased husbands. So part of being a patron is, or an influencer, is leading trends that follow long after your death. And this is from, what's the date? This is from 350 BC, and from that point on, people looked back at Artemisia II as an exemplar of how one can honor one's deceased spouse through the commission of great works of art. Roxolana is probably the most influential woman in the history of the Ottoman Empire. She was a Ukrainian peasant girl who was captured as a slave. She became one of the 150 concubines in Suleiman the Magnificent's harem, but she was by far the favorite. She wound up marrying the Sultan, which wasn't the done thing. She also had multiple children with him. Otherwise, concubines were meant to have only one child. And she lived in her own palace. Then she moved into his palace, which had never been done before. And she was nicknamed the Joyful. They seem to have really been in love with each other. And she commissioned all sorts of major building projects throughout the Ottoman Empire, including in Mecca and Jerusalem. And she is supposedly was not particularly beautiful, but she was so charming and witty that everyone loved her. And she's one of the most influential women in European history, but again, we don't get enough headlines for them. And I've been choosing older case studies. There are loads more modern ones, but just to not leave you all alone with, we have some modern influencers, and in fact, in New York, it's actually not even circa. In New York, in November of 1929, we have the original Ladies Who Lunch. Is that a term that you've heard before? But they're not messing around. The implication is these are influential society women who make things happen when they're meeting over lunch. And this was literally the first one, the origin of the term. These 3 met over lunch, November 1929. This is Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, the wife of John Rockefeller Jr., the oil magnate. This is Lily P. Bliss, from a very wealthy textile family from Boston. Independent woman, she drove her own car. This was quite radical at the time. And both of them had extremely sophisticated contemporary art collections. And this was considered socially unacceptable. Modern art was too kooky for New York high society. They liked old, dead white European men. That's fine, I like them too, but they were not allowed to dabble in this modern art business. But these women did. And they were friends with Matisse and hanging out with these artists and collecting. And they decided that they would make their own museum because the Metropolitan Museum of Art was the stuffy old traditional one, and they did not want to accept any gifts of modern art. And so this is also Mary Quinn Sullivan. She was an art teacher. She was the one who was not wealthy among the group, but they were all close friends, and they decided they were going to make a modern art museum in New York, and together they founded MoMA. And it began with 180 pictures donated by her, 150 donated by her, and Mary Quinn Sullivan was in charge of the didactic side, the educational side of the museum. And thanks to them, essentially modern art came to America, thanks to them and their lunch. So I think I should stop here. There's loads more, of course, but thank you so much for your attention.